The sun had only just begun to stretch its golden fingers across the rooftops of the harbor city when the Sultan's ship, the Elysian, prepared to cast off. A subtle breeze stirred the crimson sails, and the scent of salt oil and ancient wood hung in the air like a promise. From the quay, it looked like a painting come to life, polished hull gleaming, banners fluttering, guards in polished bronze. Yet beneath the splendor, nerves pulsed like an undercurrent, none more so than in Kale. Kale was no stranger to elegance. His garments were tailored from the finest linens, dyed in oceanic tones that mirrored his eyes, and he wore the mark of the royal court upon his collar. But his posture betrayed a rigidity that didn't belong to sea-born men. Though he stood beside the Sultan among the group of trusted courtiers, he did so with the stillness of someone out of place. The others shifted their weight with the easy rhythm of men accustomed to tides and sails, while Kale looked more like a man balancing on the edge of a roof. He had never been on a ship before. His life until now had been composed of council chambers, parchment maps, ceremonial duties, and quiet acts of service behind heavy doors. His mind was sharp and disciplined, trusted for clarity in chaos, but the sea did not respond to logic. As the gangplank was drawn up and the ship began its glide from the dock, Kale's breath caught. The shore, the solid certainty of it, fell away too quickly. At first, he tried to hide his discomfort, standing tall beside the Sultan, smiling at jokes made in a language he had once mastered but now barely heard. But the longer he remained adrift, the more he felt the weight of something ancient and wild pressing on him. The ship groaned as it adjusted to the open sea, and Kale, for the first time in many years, felt completely unmoored, not just physically but inwardly. The court had taught him to silence his fear. The sea amplified it. By mid-morning, a thin sheen of sweat clung to his temples. The others ate and laughed, gathering at the main deck where musicians played light tunes and servants brought spiced tea. Kale remained near the rail, gripping it with knuckles drained of color. His thoughts spiraled. What if the sea grew violent? What if the vessel splintered? What if his fear was seen and worse mocked? The Sultan, warm in both voice and presence, approached him gently. "Kale, my friend," he said, laying a hand on his shoulder, "you've faced far more difficult storms within the palace walls. The sea cannot harm what is already steady inside." Kale nodded but said nothing. He was not steady. Not anymore. Among the crew, unnoticed until now, was a quiet man with a face like weathered stone, Elias, an aging scholar invited on board not for status but for wisdom. He watched Kale silently, noting the tightness in his jaw, the hollow between his breaths. There was something deeper here than mere seasickness. This was a man wrestling something much older than the waves. As twilight approached, Kale remained at the stern, eyes locked on the fading coastline. He didn't notice Elias standing behind him until he spoke. "It's not the sea you fear," the scholar said softly. "It's the letting go." Kale turned, startled, but Elias offered only a slight nod as if to say, "You need not reply. The sea will answer for you in time." The voyage had only just begun, yet something within Kale was already being tested. The storm, when it arrived, would not come from the sky, but from within. And only by being thrown into it would Kale learn that calmness, like courage, is not the absence of fear but the choice to keep sailing through it. The first night at sea came cloaked in moonlight, calm and deceptively gentle. Lanterns swung slowly from the beams, casting soft amber pools across the deck, and the laughter of the courtiers still echoed faintly from the main quarters. But Kale remained awake, pacing silently by the railing, the salted wind cutting across his cheeks like whispers of something old and merciless. His mind had become its own storm. Each creak of the wood, each distant groan of the ship's hull against the tide was magnified inside him. He tried to recall the Sultan's words, about steadiness, about storms past before, but they rang hollow now. This was not a council debate or a quiet political feud. This was the unknown stretching endlessly in every direction. And he, Kale, master of composure, reader of nuance, tactician of the court, was unraveling. By the second day it could no longer be hidden. He refused food. His hands shook when anyone spoke his name. The sky had darkened slightly, not into a storm but into a muted, ominous gray. To Kale it was a warning. He grew erratic. His breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps. He gripped the sides of the ship as if they were the last solid things in a world slipping from beneath him. When a wave larger than the rest struck the ship's bow, causing it to lurch even slightly, Kale screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of something deeper. Raw, human terror erupting like a fault line had broken open inside him. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the deck, his voice ragged with panic. "We're going to drown," he cried, "We're not meant to be out here, this is death. This is death in disguise." The courtiers froze, unsure. Some scoffed. Others looked away, embarrassed for him. The Sultan, seated nearby beneath the main mast, watched in quiet distress. This was the man who had calmly handled insurgent threats, who once negotiated peace between warring clans with a single afternoon of words, and now he was sobbing on the floor of a ship, paralyzed by invisible phantoms. It was Elias, the old scholar, who moved. He stepped through the circle of hesitation and approached Cale slowly. He did not speak. He did not offer platitudes. Instead, he knelt beside him. Cale's hands were trembling, fingers white from pressure. His eyes darted around, looking for something solid, something unmoving. Elias placed his palm gently over Cale's hand, grounding him. "The mind," he said finally, "is capable of conjuring oceans far crueler than this one." Cale looked at him, uncomprehending. His lips parted to speak, but all that came out was a shallow breath. Elias nodded, his eyes neither pitying nor condescending. "Let it happen. Let the fear crest. Let it show you its shape." But Cale was not ready to listen. Not yet. That night he slept only in fragments. He awoke screaming once, soaked in sweat, convinced he was sinking. Servants exchanged worried glances. Even the Sultan, once full of joy for the voyage, now walked the deck with furrowed brows. What began as a celebration was shifting. Cale's fear had infected the air. And yet, beneath it all, a quiet transformation was brewing, not visible, not immediate, but real. In his rawness, Cale was being stripped of titles, of masks, of the version of himself that had always been in control. The ship had taken them far from land, yes, but also from illusion. Elias, watching from the shadows, understood. Sometimes fear does not break a man. Sometimes, it cracks him open just wide enough for something new to grow. The sea had not yet claimed Cale. But it had forced him to look straight into the mouth of his dread. And it was only the beginning. By the third morning, the once radiant journey had curdled into tension. The Sultan no longer dined with delight beneath the open sky but sat silent, gazing into the endless water, weighed down by the dissonance between what this voyage had promised and what it had become. Whispers of concern passed between crew and courtiers alike, not about storms or pirates but about Cale, the man they once revered, now reduced to a shadow pacing in his own madness. Cale had not spoken in full sentences for hours. His eyes had taken on the distant, glassy look of someone haunted by an enemy no one else could see. He flinched at the flap of sails. He jolted at the laughter of others as though joy were an affront. He had not touched food in days. His voice was hoarse from either silence or whispered terror, no one could tell which. That evening, as the sun began to lower itself into the horizon like a flickering wick, Elias finally approached the Sultan again. His robes were simple, marked only by the salt wind and age. But his gaze, as always, held a strange calm, like still water that knew of storms but did not fear them. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "I ask again what I asked before, permission to intervene but without question or hesitation." The Sultan studied him for a moment, then nodded with a heaviness that seemed to surrender more than authority. "Do what you must." Elias did not wait. He turned and walked toward the deck where Cale now sat curled against a barrel, trying to disappear into the wood. The others followed at a distance, unsure, a growing sense of unease wrapping itself around the ship like a fog. When Elias spoke, his voice was calm. "Take him." The crew hesitated. "Take him," Elias repeated. "Lift him. And throw him into the sea." The world stopped. Someone laughed, thinking it a metaphor. Someone else gasped. One of the guards stepped forward, alarmed. "He's not well. He'll drown." Elias met the man's eyes. "He's already drowning. Just not in water." The Sultan raised a hand. There was a long silence. Then, reluctantly, the sailors moved. Cale screamed as they touched him, wild, feral, like an animal sensing fire. He clawed at the deck, cried out in disbelief, begging, but his voice was raw and broken. "No. No, please, I can't, I won't survive, They hurled him into the sea. The splash was sharp, clean. The sky seemed to gasp with him. For a moment, nothing. Then chaos. Cale emerged, thrashing violently, salt water crashing into his lungs, panic blooming in his chest like fire. There was no floor, no wood, no rail to cling to. Only depth. Only cold. His limbs kicked in every direction. He screamed, not of imagined deaths but of the very real, immediate fear of drowning. Elias stood calmly by the railing, watching. "Now," he said, "pull him back." Ropes were tossed and hands reached over the edge. Cale grasped with all he had, his fingers bleeding against the coarse hemp. They dragged him aboard. He collapsed on the deck, coughing, shivering, soaked to the bone. He clung to the wooden planks as if they were sacred. There were no more words in him, only gasps. His body trembled, but his eyes had changed. They were no longer searching the horizon for doom. They were staring directly at the deck beneath him as if truly seeing it for the first time. "It's real," he whispered. "It holds." The crew backed away, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The courtiers looked to the Sultan, who said nothing. Elias simply knelt beside Kale again, just as he had before. "You feared the idea of drowning," he said gently. "But now you have drowned. And risen." Kale looked at him, eyes rimmed red, voice hoarse. "Why? Why would you do that?" Elias offered only a thin, sorrowful smile. "Because I once lived with fear until it became my god. Ruled me. And I learned the only way to kill a god is to stop worshipping it. The sea does not care about your fear. But now you no longer feed it." Kale said nothing more. He laid back, letting the deck cradle him. The ship rocked beneath him as it always had, but now it felt different. Not less dangerous, but more honest. The others returned to their places. That night, the sky stretched open and vast above them, and for the first time since the journey began, Kale slept. Not because the sea had changed, but because he had. Kale did not speak of the sea the next morning. But something in his presence had shifted, not just in how he walked or looked, but in the silence he now wore. It was not the silence of fear, tight, brittle, full of tension, but the quiet of someone who had screamed into the void and heard no echo back. A quiet that had surrendered, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. He stood alone near the railing, arms resting on the damp wood, his shirt still bearing the salt stains of the night before. The crew gave him space, though now with a wary respect. They'd seen something not many ever did, a man break and reform in the span of a few waves. He was no longer the noble whose terror had haunted the deck like a storm cloud. He was something less predictable now, less fragile, perhaps, but more unknown. Elias watched from the stern. He knew the signs. The shaking hands pretending to be still, the eyes constantly drawn to the water as if they owed it something. Survival, he knew, was a transaction. And Kale had just paid with everything he thought he understood about fear. Later that afternoon, Kale approached him, wordlessly at first. They stood side by side, leaning against the rail. It was Elias who spoke. "You hate me," he said without looking. Kale blinked. "I did. And now? I don't know." His voice was rough. "Honest." Elias nodded. "That's better than certainty." There was silence between them, stretched by the sound of creaking ropes and distant seabirds. Then Kale said, "I thought I was going to die." "You were?" Elias replied. "Not your body, but the part of you that lived in fear." Kale laughed quietly, the sound uneven. "That part felt very alive when I was underwater." Elias turned to him. "Fear is always loudest just before it dies. It roars so you'll mistake it for truth." Kale's fingers tightened on the rail. "It wasn't the water. It was the moment I realized no one was coming. That I might just vanish. And the world would go on. That's what cut deepest. That I'd go and everything else would stay." Elias looked at him, this man who only days ago had clawed at the deck like a child afraid of shadows. Now speaking of mortality not as myth, but as something he had touched. "And yet," Elias said, "you're still here." Kale nodded slowly. "But I'm not the same. When I was in the water, it was like every part of me that pretended to be brave, to be noble, to be in control, peeled away. And all that was left was this raw thing. Not proud. Not strong. Just real. That's the part that lives," Elias said. "The rest was armor. You don't need it anymore." Kale exhaled, and for the first time, it wasn't a shudder but a release. "I used to think bravery was about never being afraid. Now I think it's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway." Elias smiled faintly. "Then you've learned more on this ship than most learn in a lifetime." That evening, as the sun dipped behind clouds edged with fire, Kale stood at the bow alone, facing the wind. Not to conquer it. Not to fight it. Just to feel it and know that it could move through him without tearing him apart. The water no longer whispered death. It simply spoke, of depth, of silence, of truths that couldn't be told, only survived. He didn't tell the others what had happened in the water. Not fully. He didn't need to. Something in how he moved told the story louder than words could. And though the ship sailed forward unchanged in wood and rope, something in its rhythm felt steadier now, as if the sea had acknowledged him, and let him pass. The next day, Kale was no longer the man everyone had known. Perhaps he couldn't explain it, but deep inside, there had truly been a transformation, like a hard shell cracking open, revealing a part of himself that had never been seen before. Fear no longer held him. Instead, there was a strange peace, not something he had found, but something he had accepted as part of his existence. The journey continued, but the sea was no longer the same. Every wave, once threatening, was now a silent partner, an acceptance that Cale had never understood until he was forced to face it. Cale stood still at the edge of the deck, where the sunlight reflected off the bright ocean. He could feel the gentle breeze passing by, but it no longer felt like sharp arrows. Now the wind was just wind and the waves were simply waves. And he was just Cale, a small man standing amid the vastness of it all. In the past, he had always viewed the world as a storm, one that could overwhelm him at any moment. But today he saw it like an old friend, something that had once frightened him but now only felt familiar. He sat down on the deck, his hand resting on the solid wood, the stability beneath his palm, a feeling he had never truly appreciated before. The cracks in his heart, the anxieties and fears that had clung to him for years, seemed to be subsiding. He looked out towards the horizon where the sun was setting, casting red and orange hues across the sky. The sound of waves lapping against the side of the ship was steady, like a repeating song, as if it was teaching him something. "You're not the same as before," Elias said from behind him, without needing to turn around. He had been watching Cale all morning, noticing the change in his eyes. It wasn't an obvious change, but a quiet stillness, something that couldn't be explained in words. Cale didn't respond immediately. He smiled naturally without any forced effort. "I no longer feel like I need to fight against it," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I used to think I had to conquer everything around me to find peace. But now I understand that all I need to do is not run from it." Elias sat down beside him, his gaze shifting away from the sea but still focused ahead. "That's what we all learn over time. You can't conquer everything. You can only learn to live with it." Cale looked at the water, where the gentle waves brushed against the side of the ship. "I thought I would never be able to accept my fear. But now it feels like I've come to grips with it. It doesn't control me anymore. I'm the one who decides when to face it." A quiet pause passed, with only the sound of the waves. Cale's words were not only an acknowledgement of the fear that once dominated him, but a new declaration of how he viewed life. Before, when confronted with uncertainty, he had reacted by running away. But now he understood that the truth wasn't escape, it was confrontation. And when he faced it, he found the strength to stand firm no matter the storm. Elias turned to him, his eyes steady. "You've done what many people never dare to do, look your fear in the eye and not let it control you anymore. That's what true maturity looks like." Cale didn't respond immediately, but inside, everything seemed clear. He no longer feared the future, no longer worried about things that hadn't happened yet. He had lived through this moment, and this moment was all that he had. He realized that change wasn't some grand revolution, but a small step, a simple yet profound acceptance. That life might not be perfect, but it was still worth living. And as Cale stood up, the sun had set behind the horizon, leaving a faint glow on the surface of the sea. He knew that, no matter how many challenges lay ahead, he had found a part of his strength that he had never thought possible. Not from grand battles or resounding victories, but from a deep shift in the way he viewed himself. Aaron stood silently, gazing at the horizon where the vast sea blended with the sky, stretching endlessly. The atmosphere now felt different from the previous times. No longer was there anxiety or fear of the challenging journey ahead. Instead, a quiet peace settled within him, as if he had discovered a part of himself that had been lost for so long. Cale approached him, his breath blending with the sea breeze. He knew that Aaron always had a reason behind his every action. His decisions, his words of advice, and even his surprising silences. But Aaron had never shared with him the story of his past, the events that had shaped him into the man he was today. "Aaron, you always keep a distance," Cale spoke softly, his voice low, not rushed, not trying to pry. "I think I've come to understand you more since we boarded this ship. But there's one thing I still don't understand. Why were you willing to let me face this fear? Why did you believe that I could confront it?" Aaron slowly turned his head, his eyes deep like the ocean, unreadable. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at Cale as if reflecting on what words to say. Cale waited, patient, knowing Aaron's silence often spoke louder than anything else. "Maybe you think I don't care about you or that I'm testing you," Aaron began, his voice steady, his words measured, each one sinking deeper into Cale's mind. "But the truth is, I wanted you to understand something. Life isn't about controlling it, it's about accepting it as part of who you are. You cannot defeat your fears by avoiding them, by trying to control everything. You can only live with them, face them, and only then can you grow. Kale listened in silence, not interrupting. He had come to realize that Aaron never spoke lightly. Each of his words had been earned through lived experience. There was definitely a deeper reason behind why Aaron understood this truth so profoundly. Aaron continued, his gaze unwavering, locking eyes with Kale, as if he wanted him to truly comprehend the gravity of what he was saying. I used to be just like you. A person constantly afraid, always feeling like I couldn't overcome the boundaries I set for myself. I lived in that fear for so long, that one day I realized I had locked myself in a cage. I was afraid to face it. I was afraid to look at what was really inside me. Kale listened intently, sensing the sincerity in Aaron's words, but still not fully understanding. So what made you change? He asked. Aaron closed his eyes. A silence hung in the air. He remembered the difficult years, the times when he struggled with himself, not against any outside force, but with the invisible battles within. There had been a time when he thought he couldn't survive the internal war. But when everything seemed beyond his control, he had no choice but to change his perspective. I lost a lot of things, Aaron said. I lost people I cared about. I lost my trust in myself. And when everything crumbled, I realized that I had no other choice but to face myself. I had to find a way to live with the fear, to accept it as a part of who I am. And only when I stopped fighting against it, did I realize that I wasn't weak but just human. There are times when we are weak and times when we need to be strong. Kale felt something shift within himself as he listened to Aaron. It wasn't just empathy but a deeper understanding of how Aaron viewed the world, how true strength came not from trying to avoid pain or fear, but from learning to live with it. Aaron continued, his eyes looking directly at Kale. When I see you, I see the version of myself from the past. Your fear isn't an enemy, it's a companion that you have to learn to live with. That's why I believe you'll find your strength in that fear. Just like me, you'll learn to face it and eventually overcome it. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. I believe you'll do it. Kale looked into Aaron's eyes, feeling as though he had entered a new world, not one of grand victories, but one of acceptance and a deeper understanding of himself. He knew now that he no longer had to fear fear itself, that he just needed to face it, accept it as an inseparable part of life. And in that moment, Kale realized he had learned an important lesson from Aaron. True strength does not come from controlling life, but from knowing how to accept and live with the things we cannot control. As Kale stood at the edge of the ship, the world seemed to have transformed in ways he never could have imagined before. The storm within him had settled, and in its place, there was a quiet sense of understanding, an acknowledgement that fear no longer had to control him. He had confronted it, faced it head-on, and emerged not victorious in the traditional sense, but at peace with it. This journey, not just across the sea but within his own heart, had taught him something profound. That peace isn't something you find by conquering the world, but something you gain when you stop running from your own fear. The message was clear, echoing in the stillness of his mind. Only when we stop trying to escape from our fears, only when we embrace them fully, do we find the strength to rise above them. Kale had learned that life, in its rawness and unpredictability, could be accepted, not by avoiding the dangers it presents, but by facing them with open eyes and an open heart. As the ship sailed on, leaving the sunset behind and moving toward an uncertain future, Kale understood that his true journey had only just begun. And it wasn't the storm that he needed to fear anymore, it was his own willingness to stand firm in the face of whatever came next. Fear would always be there, but it no longer had the power to control him. The strength was within him all along, waiting to be recognized, embraced, and ultimately, used to face the future one moment at a time.